Hello and welcome to CX Today. My name is Charlie. I am the head of publication here, and I'm thrilled today to introduce a discussion all around the Gartner Magic Quadrant for CCaaS 2025. And joining me for that conversation are two excellent speakers. Yes, I'd like to be joined by Zeus Kerravala, Principal Analyst at ZK Research, and Liz Miller, VP and Principal Analyst at Constellation Research. Thanks very much both for joining me. And I want to start this conversation by just considering each vendor's placement within the famous Gartner Magic Quadrant matrix. I'm going to put out a graphic now on everybody's screens that shows the lay of the land. Unfortunately, I can't show you the full matrix as now that requires authorization from Gartner, but it should give you an idea of how all the vendors performed. So we have nice Genesys AWS Five9 Talkdesk in that leader quadrant, and that's the top right hand quadrant. We have Content Guru in the challenger quadrant, that's the top left. And we have no Visionaries this year, which is interesting in itself, in bottom right. And then we have Cisco, Zoom, and Vonage in the niche player bottom left hand quadrant. But before we start discussing like the placement of these vendors and more sort of insight from the report, I think it'd be great to get both of your views on how contact center buyers should be using reports like the Magic Quadrant, and whether it's still sort of a valuable resource in the sense that contact centers have such different buying needs. Zeus, maybe I'll start with you on that one. What's your thoughts on how an enterprise contact center buyer should be using this?
Yeah, well, I think these kinds of reports have a lot of value. Like, for instance, if you're out in the woods, you need from some fire starter, you can print it off and use it as that. But besides that, Charlie, these things are what they are, right? They're a guide, I think, to help you understand who's in the space. I certainly would not take it as a definitive statement on, who's the best and who's not. In fact, I think Gartner itself tries to be very cagey about that by naming things visionaries, challengers, leaders, things like that, so to not imply one is better than the other. They're just different, right? And so as a buyer, in fact, I had a conversation with the CIO about this quadrant last week, and she was complaining that there isn't any context to it. And that's the big problem. It's like, if you're a small business with simple contact center needs, obviously, you're going to have different requirements than a large 20,000 seat contact center with very complicated needs. And so trying to create one guide with all of the with the definitively states one by the other is very difficult. So I think if you're a buyer, use this maybe as a way to understand who's in the space, but then you have to apply the criteria for your own organization to this, and then probably figure out how to move those vendors around. And I talked to somebody, other analysts and things like that, or even other customers, and because everyone's needs are different, and that's the problem with trying to create a guide like this. It doesn't really reflect the unique nature of everybody's business. It just tries to create a blanket one. But I do think it's good for a shortlist tool. Although I think there's a number of vendors in this case. I think there's some missing, but that's the way I would use it. In fact, when I was in corporate IT, I would use it just to understand who I should RFP and who I shouldn't. But in no way did I look at this as any kind of accurate scoring methodology, because the needs, like I said, of one organization are different than others.
I think the thing, I know this won't come as a surprise to anyone who tunes into these from CX Today regularly. I totally agree with everything that he just said. So that shouldn't be a shock. What I'll add to that is, I think when people look at the Magic Quadrant, it's about established, scalable, these are the folks you can rely on. That tends to be in that top quadrant, right? But if you're a fast-moving mid-market and you're like, I want to innovate the heck out of this, I want to completely reimagine how my contact center operates, what tools we use, is it voice forward, are we AI forward? I'll be honest with you, a lot of times where you're looking is that Visionaries category, right? You're not necessarily looking for the guys who've been doing it for 20 years and we've been doing it the same way for 20 years, but we've added some new stuff in it. Like, we moved to the cloud, we have some AI. That's not necessarily your jam. That's not exactly what your organization wants. So I think that when you start to look at a quadrant, I think the number one way that I always tell our end buyers to use it is, if people outside of your function don't get what it is that you're trying to do. They're going to look at these brand names and they're going to be like, wait a minute, name your hyperscalers here. Like insert the big names, insert the folks you know. And they're going to look at contact center and be like, we can't possibly do any of this because I don't know, nor do I trust any of these names because I don't use them. Magic quadrants are amazing to be able to walk into that group of folks and say, listen, this is professional third-party validation for this is why I'm sending an RFP out to this group. This is why, this is what my short list looks like. So I find a ton of value. But where I tend to find a lot more value is in the report itself, when they start to talk about the nuance in between the players, right? And I think that is where the interest of this is. Of course, not everyone has access to that, so that can always be a challenge. But what I would encourage enterprise buyers to do is actually think about where you want to be as far as a technology stack. Are you looking at someone who's like in hyper innovation mode? Your stack screams visionary. Don't look at the niche player. Like, you might not want to look there, but you also might not want to look at the leaders, right? So I think where you look really has to do with not only the reality of your market and your maturity, but also your organization and where your technology is looking to lean forward. And I think what this really represents is a maturity scale of the market. Like when I look at the results, we're knocking on the door of commoditization. And Zeus, you better than anyone knows what those lists start to look like. We start seeing UCaaS several years ago, right? When everyone starts to cluster up there in the leaders, right? When you're either a leader or you're a niche, you might be a commodity.
Yeah. I think it's important to understand too how these things are built. And like Gartner largely uses inquiries from their customers to help guide what this should look like. And so understand Gartner's customer base is a lot of large US enterprises. And so the needs of a European company are going to be quite different, right? Data sovereignty, things like that. Especially once you get into Asia, that's not a stronghold for Gartner, right? They tend to use other sources. And they don't have a lot of small businesses. They typically can't afford Gartner. So if you're a large US enterprise, this is probably pretty accurate, right? You're a small company, a school, you're a European mid-sized organization, healthcare organization, something like that. This may not meet your needs. And that's where, to Liz's point, look at the narrative, right? And understand, in the text, how they thought about this, because that if I were to, well, I know you're going to ask me this later, Charlie, but if there's one big flaw in this, it's a very inward view from Gartner versus kind of a market look, and I think that's a challenge for them. They just don't have enough context, outside of their customer base, and not everybody's a Gartner customer.
Yeah, I think there was lots of interesting points there. I want to go back to Liz's point as well around how this sort of people clustered in the leader column. And as you said to me before, Zeus, it was more like a magic line than a magic quadrant in terms of how it looked on the
matrix. The fact there's no visionaries is troubling in itself, because there are visionaries in the space, and how
the quadrant are.
Yeah, and I think this might be the worst MQ I've seen in a long time in the space. It just, for them to not recognize some of the visionary work that some vendors are doing, I think, again, shows that the misalignment that Gartner has with the industry right now.
And it's also the rigidity of their categories, right? I think there tends to be an issue. And I think, in fairness to Gartner, all the large firms that do these types of rankings, right? You want to put them on a wave, you want to put them in a quadrant or a line, you've got a spectrum, a scope, a web, whatever it is, you start to make your judgments in like measures of inches and pixels. And, like when these come out, I mean, we see it in our industry, right? Like the day this comes out, there's a certain analyst will get out the ruler and be like, here's last year's, here's this year's, what is the difference between the dots? And they will look at that kind of stuff, right? And they get super stoked about it. But I think the reality here is that if you're having to plot this, you're having to pick a path and you're having to stick to it. And Gartner picked a path. The path they picked was, you had to have a certain threshold of numbers of seats, which not a lot of organizations are going to have, right? The vendors here, there's a little fuzzy math. I think there are a lot of questions that a lot of people have been having about certain vendors that are on this list of like, okay, is that pure CCaaS? Is that your CCaaS plus plus plus? Is it everybody who has a seat? So there's lots of questions. There's also lots of questions over people who aren't on here. And I think what the biggest thing that I have heard from this, specifically from end users and end buyers, is, yeah, but I don't have that kind of money. Because when they look at this, they just see dollar signs like rolling across. I'm a mid-market company. I need 70 seats. I don't need 100. I'm going to max out, and my goal is actually to start at 20. So how do I look at this? And I think it's unfair to some degree for those folks who are in that small business, in that mid-market business. But let's also be honest, it's unfair to a lot of the folks that are in that leader column, because you know what? A lot of their bread and butter was made on the backs of mid-market companies who scaled and could get to those 100-seat thresholds. So it's a challenge.
Yeah, I mean, I'll step back a little bit. You both mentioned how there wasn't any visionaries, which I find this year, I find quite interesting as well. I don't know. Obviously, I don't want to be one of those people that gets out the ruler and starts saying, "Oh, we should this vendors."
All right. Well, there's yeah.
But like, which vendors do you think maybe like what were there any that surprised either of you in terms of which quadrant they finished in? I don't know. Maybe Zeus, if you want to start on that one.
Yeah, I think probably the two biggest surprises were Zoom's placement and WebEx. I think if I were to find the classic visionary, it's Zoom, right? Zoom's trying to do this industry, change contact center. They've applied AI companion across all their products. They've come up with a lot of features. Sure, are they the classic? In fact, they entered the market through video, right? And so are they the classic contact center? No, but that's the definition of a visionary. And for them to pop up on this chart below Vonage, Zoom's selling a lot of big seats as well. Like they on their earnings call, they talk about, 5, digit seat count wins and things like that. So they're winning big deals. A lot of times they're not entering through the traditional contact center buyer, but that to me defines visionary. And then for WebEx to be niche, I don't even understand that. Nobody does big better than Cisco. And here's again where it's one of the challenges of the quadrant is they try and look at product in isolation. Cisco has a massive contact center install base. A lot of it's on-prem, and they've been flipping all those to the WebEx contact center. They've done a good job of upgrading WebEx contact center, adding some AI features in, and they're converting that base. And to me, that again is the definition of what a challenger would be, right? Is in the classic sort of sense. And so, if I were to pick one visionary that should have been visionary in Zoom, Cisco should have been a challenger. I don't think they're really a leader yet, but those are the two that I think were probably miscategorized. I also think that, and I like the team over a 5.9, but to put them in a leader quadrant when all their executives are changing, I would have at least for one quadrant have moved them out of that to see what the company looks like a year from now, because you have to question, their execution ability if they're changing everybody from CMO, CEO, head of sales, right? Obviously, those changes are being made for a reason. And so to say you were a leader this year, last year, this year, to me seems a little, a little strange. And so those are the ones that I would look at.
I think they got caught in the editing dip, right? Because I think all of the change and all of the turmoil that happened actually happened probably right when this was going into editing, right when it was going into review, right? So it's very possible that
you create a cutoff date for a document, you publish it months later, and then you say this is Gartner's truth for another year. I mean, it's an electronic document, for God's sakes. Make some edits to it, right? So but that I think is one of the problems is you're trying to use data and make it last for a whole year. If you want to say 5.9's a leader and they didn't know about the executive changes before, fine. But Zoom should definitely be a visionary. Cisco should be up in the challenger quadrant, And I don't really understand how they can't be. It just even by their
Yeah.
own definition, they would fit.
I totally agree. I'll be honest with you. The one that had me shaking my head, like just scratching my head a little bit, was TalkDesk, also being in that leaders category. I just think hearing from so many customers, and to be fair, customers who are really happy with how their implementations are going, customers that are kind of really happy that they're chugging along, but some of the technologies and some of the way the platform comes together, there's, in my mind, there's still a challenger, right? And I would say, and I would argue, if you went and looked at like a peer review, and if you started to look at the kind of disparity, you have people who love them and people who do not, right? I think that they are pulling their things together, and I think that they are really putting in the hard work where it needs to be, and customers are realizing that. And I will also say partners are realizing that, but
Mhm.
I consistently hear a but from their partners, right? TalkDesk is doing great. They're moving forward, but that's not
Mhm.
to say it's not a solid solution. That's, again, to Zeus's point, that's not to say that you shouldn't look at them. But I think that big seats and a checklist of capabilities, they're growing that checklist. They are pushing the needle. I would have probably put them in that challenger category more so than a leader category. Their pop over there was a bit of a surprise.
Yeah, well, they moved into Visionary last year, and I guess they, met a lot of the Gartner criteria to
Executed.
move back to leader. Yeah, yeah. So, that was one. The other vendor chart, I'm always surprised at how close. Like, to me, the de facto kind of runaway leader in this category is nice. Like, they've
Nice.
done
Yeah.
everything they need to do. They've got a great product roadmap. They acquired Cognigy, right? They got WFM, WM, and to me, the gap between them and Genesis should be bigger. Genesis is an interesting one. There's no argument that they're a leader. They do a lot of big things well, but you talk to some of their customers, like the ones they've migrated from their on-prem to cloud, a lot of those migrations have gone terribly. There's a reason why, like a lot of their big customers, UBS and things like that, haven't gone to Genesis Cloud. It's because it's not at feature parity with Genesis on-prem, and so if I do think they deserve to be a leader based on their install base and things like that, but the gap between them and NICE should be bigger. And actually, I would have put AWS ahead of Genesis at this point, but I like how AWS approaches this market again with an AI first mentality, things like that, where I look at Genesis a little bit more old school. In fact, if you could create a fifth quadrant around disruptor, I would have thrown AWS in, as the lone part of that, because I do think
Yeah.
Pasquale and team have really done a nice job of rethinking how you want to approach this from through the lens of AI first, right?
I totally agree with you. I think that
Yeah.
their actual vision for where they want not just connect, but everything, that if you are an AWS shop and you can develop an AWS, how much farther you can take this if you want to extend it. And again, when we're talking large enterprises, which is what this quadrant is really ideal for, right? That enterprise grade, you've likely got that. You're likely running on AWS. You likely have those
Mhm.
developers. So you can build a whole lot around that module of Connect, and you can start to see where AWS is taking that kind of core of engagement. And it's really impressive. I mean, their vision, quite frankly, is far ahead. Certainly where, anyone in that leader category, PQ's thinking way ahead of the curve. And I give him a
Yeah.
whole lot of credit for that. What I will say in regard to Genesis, I think that the kind of the proximity of Genesis to NICE on the plotting, I think it has more to do, in my opinion, with the strength of the partnerships on the Genesis side. Now, that will start to gap because NICE has really doubled down, and Scott has really doubled down on intentional, big, enterprise grade partnerships that are really going to make a huge difference, right? You make a big partnership with the likes of ServiceNow, you're going to see that start to move
Mhm.
up, and they're going to start to pull away from a lot of that pack as we start to see more of that motion come together. But Genesis's relationships with both ServiceNow and Salesforce have opened up something very, very important from the realm of where Genesys has been used to selling, which has been that contact center buyer. They're now speaking directly with the CIO because they're speaking through ServiceNow, and they're going in together with these deals, and they're transforming communications on a ServiceNow backbone, right? And that is a very different sales motion than Genesys was really ever used to. And I think that when people were like, oh, ServiceNow is partnering with everybody, absolutely they are. But Genesys really doubled down on their investment of building native integrations that just made it easy. And for any CIO who's looking at their ServiceNow, they're looking at that ServiceNow landscape, and it's not easy, right? ServiceNow is a great solution, but it is not an easy, nor is it an inexpensive solution. So the last thing you want is a contact center solution coming up here that doesn't just quickly and easily fit into what your service and what your service delivery architecture is going to look like. And I think Genesys has benefited from that, kind of the tide rising, thanks to folks like ServiceNow and Salesforce.
Yeah. And actually, to your point, though, if you can take NICE's ability to homegrow products, right?
Yep.
And really, when you think about this coming together now of WEM, WEF, quality management, contact center. NICE really was the visionary in doing that first, but you're right, they didn't have the partnerships. And so, now if you can marry that with the Genesys like partnerships, I mean, I do think we're going to see them pull away. They're really the class of the industry right now. When you talk about AWS, it's interesting too that this is another area where the Magic Quadrant is challenged, is because it looks at the product, not the company. And so if you're a big enterprise and you're heavily invested in AWS and using Bedrock and using SageMaker, and you got a bunch of credits you got to burn, right? This is where Connect, Connect becomes almost a no-brainer, but that's not really reflected. And so I always find it funny when you see Amazon in any Magic Quadrant and their ability to execute is below anybody, because frankly, they could buy the entire rest of the industry.
I mean, the funnier part is that here they're listed as Amazon Web Services, when in reality the product is Amazon. There's a distinction between AWS and Amazon, and it's very intentional, right? But what I think is funny is those top two leaders, NICE and Genesys, guess who you can burn down credits with, right? They were both like, hey, we got to be on the AWS marketplace because Genesys wants you to find them in the AWS marketplace. And the reality is, and Five9's doubled down on that as well, right? But they've also expanded out to Azure. So is Talkdesk.
I think all the leaders.
Yeah, they all want you to find them in the marketplace. Like if you're an enterprise, go to the marketplace, spend on your credits. It's kind of like this rinse and repeat across every sector right now, and it's very valid. But I think that that leaders quadrant is going to have a lot of expectations on, okay, I found you through the AWS marketplace. How well do you work with all the other tools that I've both bought and built in my AWS environment? And if you're not looking at Connect because of those native integrations, and listen, you don't put Duplos in with Lego for a reason. It just doesn't fit. That's what a lot of people are going to start figuring out. And it's going to be really interesting when all that hits the fan.
You don't put Duplos in with Legos. That's an interesting analogy.
Yeah, there's lots of good stuff in there. I mean, even think back to your point around Genesys going to market with ServiceNow, and how through that they can maybe appeal more to the IT buyer, and that kind of shows how the actual people reading these reports are probably different than they were 5 years ago, that it is, these decisions are mostly led by IT now, whereas 10 years ago, it would probably be led by a contact center leader.
Very different buyer. Operations versus IT mindset, very, very different buyer. But that's where you see some of the folks who aren't on the list shine through, and they're the ones that are moving faster, quite frankly, than a good number of folks who are on that top, in that leaderboard.
That brings me to a nice question. And who would you both kind of like to see in more evaluations like this, who aren't included in the report but are doing a good job, especially within the CCaaS space?
Yeah, I think 8x8 being removed was a bit of a surprise. I saw Bruno's response to it, and I understand why. And again, here comes the problem with the context, right? So 8x8 is really a good vendor for small market, mid-market. this is the large enterprise grading tool, and so they didn't have the seat count, I think, in one region to not be on there. Although I'm not sure how Vonage still qualifies when 8x8 doesn't, but that's another story. So,
And it's an
you know,
average. I was questioning that about Zoom too. Like when
yeah,
you averages are averages. There's low numbers in there too, people. I was like,
yeah. And so they're one I would have liked to see that. And then, you know, Ring CX is probably a little early, you know, their own
yeah,
native contact center to be on there, but they're one that, again, you know, you might want to look at as a visionary, right? I think you know, they've taken an AI first approach with it. They've integrated it with CCaaS. And it's interesting too that, we all talk about the importance of UCaaS, CCaaS integration. None of the leaders have UCaaS, right? Like, and so it maybe makes you wonder about the definition of the MQ and some of the weighting they're putting on that, right? And the importance of it. So,
it's one of
you
the
know, those
reasons
are a
why I
couple.
like Microsoft. Like the
Yeah,
customers who are implementing Microsoft are really happy with their implementations, but they're not big enterprise, the big sexy logos, right? These are the quintessential mid-market. And one of the things they love most about Microsoft is it all fits together. So your teams, your office, your dynamics, it just works. There is no fight and there is no pain. And for anyone who has stood up a contact center before, there is pain, there is blood, sweat, and tears just trying to get these systems to work. And so we tend to focus in a lot on telephony and these telephony-led solutions because that, for a lot of us, was the hardest thing to juggle and manage. But, you know, that was also 20 years ago. And I
hmm,
think that lists like this, when you have really rigid qualifications and really rigid definitions that don't evolve and change with the times, you now live in a world where, yes, people want a phone number to call, but they really rely on self-service, digital channels. They want social, they need texting, they need point to multi-point texting. Like the definition of channels of that deliver this level of service, both inbound and out, is changing dramatically. So I think we're starting to see consideration lists include folks like 3C Logic, which a lot of the large firms are like, they're not a CCaaS. I'm like, well, they provide every single thing that
yeah,
the whole checklist is there. It's just
except
not the
voice.
big, but they have the number provisioning. They now have voice.
Yeah,
So I think they have, there's a lot of things there, but interestingly enough, they've got a rock solid ServiceNow partnership, and they've been going to market with ServiceNow for a very, very long time, actually probably predating folks like NICE and like Genesys. So as ServiceNow also is making that turn to become a CRM, it really does start to change. If I'm a fast moving mid-market company and I want someone who gets this, I might look at them. If I'm looking at this for a selling motion and I want this for, yes, outbound, but I need it to connect to other points, maybe it's finance, maybe it's collections, but am I going to look at a smaller niche player like a TCN? Yeah. Like they're the definition of niche player. And
yeah,
with consumption pricing, again, talk about a customer base that loves their CCAT. Like who does, outside of when I get swag that says I love my CCAS, right? Like there's not a lot of folks out there that are like, yeah, this is making me money. But you look at solutions like TCN and that's exactly what you're getting. So I think
yeah,
that for, again, solid list for enterprise, but yeah, would have loved it. Like 8x8. Honestly, I think that one's a miss.
yeah.
I do think it's a miss. But in the category of, I'd love to see the mindset expand. I think there are a lot of what we would consider niche visionaries that you could have that whole bottom section filled out with some pretty exciting solutions that can integrate into voice or have a voice solution. It's just not voice forward. It's digital forward, and it's focused on the work. It's focused on the workflows and how it connects into the rest of the IT stack. And I think that's what CIOs are going to be looking for moving forward.
Yeah, I mean, UJet's another one, right? Where they've
Yes.
got a
Yes.
strong partnership with Google. They've got a good product. I'm guessing they didn't meet a seat count qualification, a geographic one somewhere. And then when you
100%.
start talking about those alternative ones, Wildix is another one, right? in fact, Wildix and Content Guru are very similar. And so a surprise Content Guru it's made their way into the Challenger Quadrant with just really having strength in the UK and the US, but nowhere else, right? And so it's, in fact, they almost need a second quadrant for, not your classic voice CCaaS, right? And, to highlight, because there's a lot of companies in the CX space that aren't reflected on here. And to your point, Liz, I think this is a very legacy view of the world. And speaking of legacy, Avaya has been working on their CCaaS for a long time. Them to not make an appearance kind of shows that the lack of immaturity still in there, because they got big customers, but they
got big customers with lots of seats.
Yeah, but they don't have a CCaaS.
And they're global.
Yeah.
Strength in APAC. Strength, so again, it's like, but they don't call it a CCaaS, but again, would I love to see a different list? Like, let's have different color dots. Can we have green dots?
Yeah.
Like, I don't know. Like, maybe we have like different. Can we shade the dots? But I'll be honest with you, if I can say so at Constellation we have a short list, and every year I get all of the questions of, why don't you rank them? Why don't you rank them like the quadrants and the waves and and I'm like, because at the end of the day, we're literally just creating a short list for buyers to pull up for free and go see, hey, yeah, I should Google these ones first, right? And so, oftentimes the CIOs that I'll talk to who are like, listen, I've never had to buy contact center solutions before. Like, what's the lay of the land? Here it is. And you might be an enterprise, but your contact center is never going to be above 90 people. Right? Maybe you're a media organization who's never going to field calls. In fact, you want to bury that phone number so deep in the recesses of the FAQ that no one ever uses it, right? You want to be digital first. Is this the list? Is this the quadrant for you? Possibly. But there are going to be a lot of other solutions on there that I would probably recommend you also tag onto the bottom of that.
Yeah.
Excellent. I think, there's a lot of good stuff there. Actually, to go back to your point too, Liz, I was speaking to, from ServiceNow, the head of CRM for EMEA, and I asked him, like, what CCaaS partners are you really looking at and doing good business with you? And he said, NICE, Genesis, AWS, Zoom, and 3C Logic. And I thought that was surprising to hear them come up in that conversation. So yeah, that's interesting. It does shine a light on some of the good CCaaS providers in this space that maybe deserve more of the limelight. But I think we've covered a lot of ground there today, and really gone in deep on the Magic Quadrant. So I'd like to thank very much Zeus and Liz for joining me today, and also everybody for watching too. Bye for now. Hello everyone, and we are straight back to the conversation because we had an interesting following call after we stopped recording around how maybe Gartner can improve its Magic Quadrant format going forward. And Zeus, you mentioned an interesting point around how Gartner can do more to map its other pieces of research to its MQs. I don't know if you could maybe expand on that a little.
There's two big changes here. The first one is, Gartner has these visionary documents called hype cycles, in which you can take a look at the hype cycle for AI, and it's going to tell you where we are and where the trough of disillusionment is and goofy things like that. But they do tend to be a good forward look at industries. If you're going to look at a vendor as a visionary, right, you should be mapping what's in your hype cycle to that vendor, and that would be that's how you build your visionary quadrant, is like how far out they're looking. Right now, these are done by different teams. And so I think the criticism people have is when they look at an MQ, it's rear facing, you're looking at it in the rearview mirror. And when you look at the hype cycle, you're forward looking. And as a research company, they should bring it together. The big change, Charlie, is this. Understand what this is. This is an electronic document, right? And the way it's built, and Liz kind of alluded to this, is the vendors get a spreadsheet. They submit the data into
like a billion questions long.
Long. And then months and months later, a result is published. There's no reason why it's 2025. You couldn't automate the creation of the MQ from that document, especially with AI today, It would save the analysts a lot of headache, and I feel bad for the analysts that have to do this heavy lifting here. But if the goal is to maximize revenue, Gartner's done a good job of that because they publish this thing and then they license it to everybody, so you can't change it too often. If the goal is to actually produce a good research document, you could then let the vendors self-update the criteria, right? Like when WebEx 1's coming up, right? And so when WebEx 1's comes, they're going to make all these announcements, and when the products are GA, Cisco should be able to go back in and update whatever those questions were related to those, and then it refreshes it and creates a new document. It's a PDF anyways. There's no reason why you couldn't refresh it every day if you wanted to, right? But again, from a licensability standpoint, that would create a lot of problems because vendor A would have one version, vendor B would have another, vendor C. And so, here's where Gartner is in the business of doing research versus doing research. And I think that's a fundamental flaw with this and that buyers have to understand. But there's no reason why this couldn't be a living, breathing document that updates itself and that, through the vendor's own submissions.
I also think there's a funny thing that happens with the MQ, that if there was like a thing I could change, it's almost like, can you flip visionaries and leaders? Because if I'm inside a technology organization, it's great if I'm in the selling portion of the organization, it's amazing to be a leader. I want to be in a leader. If I'm in product, I want to be in visionary, because what that says is that I'm pushing the needle. I am really having a complete forward-looking innovation cycle that, to Zeus's point, is tracking that hype cycle like nobody's business and not getting caught in the trough of disillusionment, right? I'm jumping right over that and I'm going right into value. So, I'm sitting there hoping to God, if I'm in product, like be in visionaries, because oftentimes the leaders, if we're being very, very honest, what that leader is doing is with what they have today, they have a heightened ability to execute. But it's, what are you going to have tomorrow? Right? It's the okay, is this all you're going with? And that can be the view. So it's like, can we flip, like to Zeus's point, if this is interactive, if I can update from a vendor's perspective, if I can update this every day, from a buyer's perspective, can I toggle like a Rubik's Cube? Can I say the most important thing for me is this? So I flip it and then all the dots rearrange of, I want someone that has like that total vision. Ability to execute is also going to be on me, right? But like, who's the farthest over in vision if I'm not looking at that need to execute what you have today? So that interactivity, just saying.
Yeah.
Overlay peer insights, just saying, because that's another one. But then, I'm with a firm. I don't need them being bigger. I don't need that in my life. But I will say, the analysts that do this hard work, to Zeus's earlier point, this is a hard lift and a hard slog. And our colleagues who are over there are some of the smartest people that we get a chance to go to CCaaS analyst summer camp with. So this is always really, really hard work. But yeah, the selling portion of that, the business portion of that, there's a lot of opportunities that this could be a far more usable solution from the corporate and from an operator's perspective.
Yeah.
I think that's maybe a nice note to actually end on this time. But thanks again to Zeus and Liz and everyone for watching. Bye for now.